March 3, 1943. The Bismarck Sea. 6,900 Japanese soldiers packed into 8 transport ships never knew what hit them. They were supposed to reinforce New Guinea. Instead, they became statistics in what military historians now call the most lopsided aerial massacre of World War II. General George Kenney's B-25 Mitchell bombers didn't just sink ships, they rewrote the rules of naval warfare. By the time the smoke cleared, 5,700 men were dead, and the Imperial Japanese Navy learned a brutal lesson: the age of the battleship was over. This is the story of Operation Bismarck Sea, where American ingenuity turned medium bombers into ship-killing machines, and where the Pacific War's momentum shifted irrevocably in 72 hours of relentless attack. February 28, 1943. 1800 hours. Rabaul Harbor, New Britain. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura stood on the bridge of the destroyer Shikanami, watching as the final supplies were loaded onto Transport Division 18. The convoy before him represented Japan's desperate attempt to reinforce New Guinea, where 15,000 troops were slowly being strangled by Allied air superiority and naval blockades. The mathematics were simple but brutal. Needed reinforcements. The 51st Division, battle-hardened veterans from the China campaign, had been selected for this critical mission. 6,900 soldiers of the 115th Infantry Regiment, along with artillery, supplies, and equipment, were being distributed across 8 transport vessels: Kyakusei Maru, Kembu Maru, Tio Maru, Nojima, Io Maru, Taime Maru, Shinei Maru, and Oigawa Maru. Admiral Kimura commanded 8 destroyers as escorts: Shikanami, Uranami, Shirayuki, Asagumo, Yukikes, Asashio, Arashio, and Tokitsukes. On paper, it represented formidable protection. Japanese naval doctrine held that destroyers could provide adequate air defense while maintaining anti-submarine screens. They had calculated for American B-17 bombers attacking from high altitude, where destroyers' anti-aircraft guns and evasive maneuvers had proven effective in previous convoys. What they had not calculated for was what Lieutenant General George Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force, had been developing in secret at airfields across Papua New Guinea for the past 4 months. At Port Moresby, 340 miles southeast of Rabaul, Major Paul Pappy Gunn supervised final modifications on 37 B-25 Mitchell bombers. These aircraft no longer resembled standard medium bombers. Gunn, a former Navy pilot and engineering genius, had overseen a radical transformation that contradicted every principle of bomber design. The official designation was B-25C divided by D Strafer modification. The practical reality was far more revolutionary. Gunn's teams had removed the bombardier position and Norden bombsight from the nose. In their place, they had installed 8.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, 4 on each side of the nose, synchronized to fire forward. Combined with the existing top turret and side guns, each modified B-25 could bring 12 forward-firing .50 caliber guns to bear. But the true innovation lay in the attack method Kenney and Gunn had perfected through months of practice runs against wrecked ships in Port Moresby Harbor. They called it skip bombing, a technique that would transform medium bombers into the most lethal anti-ship weapons in the Pacific theater. The principle was counterintuitive. Instead of bombing from 20,000 feet where accuracy was poor and ships could maneuver, B-25s would attack at masthead height, flying directly at targets at speeds exceeding 250 miles per hour. At ranges between 200 and 400 yards, pilots would release bombs with 5-second delay fuses. The bombs would skip across the water like stones, strike the target ship's hull at or below the waterline, and detonate after penetrating the vessel. Testing had proven devastating. A single 500-pound bomb entering a ship's hull below the waterline would explode inside, creating catastrophic damage that high-altitude bombing could never achieve. The delayed fuses meant bombs would detonate inside engine rooms, cargo holds, and troop compartments rather than on deck. February 28, 1943. 2,200 hours. Allied Intelligence Headquarters, Port Moresby. Lieutenant Commander Eric Felt's Coast Watcher network had been tracking Japanese ship movements since early afternoon. The Australian-led intelligence operation, operating from hidden positions throughout New Britain and the Solomon Islands, had established a remarkably effective early warning system. Coast Watcher Ken, stationed on a ridge overlooking Rabaul Harbor, transmitted his encrypted message at 18:30 hours, 8 large transports, 8 destroyers departing Rabaul. Course southwest. Estimate 6,000 to 7,000 troops embarked. Within 30 minutes, the message reached General Kenney's headquarters. The opportunity was unprecedented. Japanese convoys typically traveled at night and hugged the coastline to minimize exposure to air attack. This convoy, designated Operation 81 by Japanese planning staff, would require approximately 3 days to reach La, traveling through the Bismarck Sea and Vichy Strait. Kenney's intelligence officers calculated the convoy's most likely route. Japanese vessels would sail southwest from Rabaul, pass north of New Britain through St. George's Channel, then turn west through the Bismarck Sea before entering Huon Gulf and finally reaching La. The route covered approximately 600 miles, most of it within range of Allied airfields at Port Moresby, Dobadura, and Milne Bay. General Kenney convened his senior commanders at 2,300 hours. Present were Major General Ennis Whitehead, commanding Advanced Echelon 5th Air Force, Colonel Frederick Smith, commanding 3rd Attack Group, and Lieutenant Colonel Donald Hall, commanding 90th Bombardment Group. The discussion was brief and decisive. "Gentlemen," Kenney began, "we have 8 transports carrying approximately 7,000 Japanese troops attempting to reinforce La. If they succeed, we'll spend the next 6 months trying to dig them out. If we sink those transports, we end Japanese offensive capability in New Guinea." The attack plan emerged from 3 hours of intensive planning. Reconnaissance flights would locate and track the convoy beginning at first light March 1. B-17 bombers from 43rd Bombardment Group would conduct high-altitude attacks to force the convoy into evasive maneuvers, breaking their defensive formation. Modified B-25 strafers from 3rd Attack Group and 90th Bombardment Group would execute skip bombing attacks at masthead height. Australian Beaufighters would provide fighter escort and strafe destroyers to suppress anti-aircraft fire. The plan represented unprecedented coordination between bomber types, nationalities, and attack methods. Nothing like it had been attempted in the Pacific War. March 1, 1943. 0615 hours. Kimura's convoy was making steady progress, maintaining a speed of 7 knots, slower than desired but necessary to keep the heavily loaded transports together. The formation sailed in 2 columns, transports in the center, destroyers screening on the flanks and ahead. Japanese lookouts spotted the first Allied aircraft at 0945 hours, a B-24 Liberator flying at extreme altitude, clearly conducting reconnaissance. Kimura noted the sighting in his log but felt confident. Single aircraft conducting surveillance were expected. His destroyers had successfully defended previous convoys against high-altitude bombing attacks. What Kimura did not know was that the B-24's crew was radioing precise coordinates to Port Moresby, where strike aircraft were already being armed and fueled. The pilot, Captain Harold Thompson, maintained his surveillance position for 2 hours, providing continuous updates on the convoy's position, speed, and formation. At Port Moresby, engines roared to life. 37 B-25 strafers began taxiing toward runways. Their crews had been briefed on skip bombing tactics. Each aircraft carried 4 500-pound bombs with 5-second delay fuses. The armorers had painted the bombs white, a psychological touch that would make them more visible skipping across the water, terrifying Japanese sailors in the final seconds before impact. March 2, 1943. 0815 hours. The Bismarck Sea. Weather conditions deteriorated overnight. Heavy cloud cover at 2,000 feet provided the convoy temporary concealment from Allied air reconnaissance. Admiral Kimura allowed himself cautious optimism. If weather remained poor, the convoy might reach the Huon Gulf before Allied bombers could mount sustained attacks. His optimism proved premature. At 1,015 hours, clouds began breaking up. By 1100 hours, visibility extended to 15 miles under scattered cloud cover. Japanese lookouts immediately spotted aircraft to the southeast, not the single reconnaissance plane from the previous day, but a formation of heavy bombers approaching at high altitude. 8 B-17 Flying Fortresses from 43rd Bombardment Group began their attack runs at 1,130 hours, bombing from 6,500 feet. The destroyers immediately began evasive maneuvers, turning into the attack to present minimal target profiles while their anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. The transports, slower and less maneuverable, could only maintain course and hope. The high-altitude bombing achieved limited success. Near misses threw up towering water columns that drenched ships' decks, and one bomb struck Kyakusei Maru aft, starting fires that damage control teams quickly contained. But the primary objective, breaking the convoy's defensive formation, succeeded perfectly. Ships scattered to avoid bomb patterns, destroyers racing to protect different transports, the tight defensive screen fragmenting. This was exactly what Kenney's plan required. At 1,210 hours, while destroyers and transports were still reforming, the modified B-25s arrived at masthead height. The Japanese had never seen anything like it. 13 B-25 strafers from 90th Bombardment Group came in just above the wave tops, their approach masked by the curvature of the Earth until they were less than 2 miles distant. At that range, traveling at 265 miles per hour, they covered the distance in less than 30 seconds, insufficient time for effective anti-aircraft response. The lead B-25, piloted by Captain William Benn, targeted Kyakusei Maru, already damaged and struggling to maintain formation. At 300 yards range, Ben opened fire with all 8 nose-mounted .50 caliber guns. The combined firepower, approximately 100 rounds per second of armor-piercing and incendiary ammunition, raked the transport's superstructure, killing anti-aircraft gun crews and shattering bridge windows. At 250 yards, Ben released his bombs in sequence, 4 500-pound weapons dropping from the B-25's belly. The first bomb hit the water 60 feet from the ship, bounced upward, and struck the hull at the waterline. The delayed fuse allowed it to penetrate the hull plating before detonating inside the forward cargo hold where 1,200 troops were sheltering. The explosion was catastrophic. The blast tore through 4 decks, rupturing the ship's structural framework and flooding compartments instantaneously. Soldiers in the cargo hold had no chance, most died in the initial explosion or drowned in the immediate flooding. Those on upper decks felt the ship shudder violently and begin settling by the bow. Ben's second and third bombs also struck home. One penetrated the engine room, destroying the main boilers and killing engineering personnel. The third hit aft, exploding in troop quarters and starting uncontrollable fires. Within 3 minutes of the attack beginning, Kyakusei Maru was listing severely, fires raging, and sinking rapidly. The other 12 B-25s in the formation had selected their targets. Each transport received multiple attacks in rapid succession. The skip bombing technique proved as devastating in combat as it had in testing. Bombs entering at waterline or below created flooding that no damage control could stop. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. March 2nd, 1943. 1,225 hours. The Bismarck Sea had transformed into a killing field. Within 15 minutes of the first B-25 attack, 3 transports were sinking or already beneath the waves. Kyakusei Maru went down first, her bow submerged, stern rising at a steep angle before sliding beneath the surface at 1,223 hours. Approximately 1,100 soldiers went down with her. Tio Maru suffered a similar fate. Captain Raymond Wilkins' B-25 had placed 3 bombs into her hull in a textbook skip bombing attack. The transport's captain, Commander Shugawa Hideaki, attempted to beach the vessel on a nearby reef, but flooding overwhelmed the engine rooms before he could reach shallow water. The ship capsized at 1,231 hours, trapping hundreds of soldiers below decks. Aboard the destroyer Shikanami, Admiral Kimura watched his convoy disintegrating. The radio channels filled with distress calls from transport captains reporting critical damage, uncontrollable flooding, and massive casualties. His destroyers attempted to screen the remaining transports, their anti-aircraft guns blazing at the low-flying B-25s, but the American bombers were simply too fast, too low, and too numerous. The Japanese destroyers faced an impossible tactical problem. Their anti-aircraft guns, primarily 25mm Type 96 weapons, required several seconds to track and engage targets. The B-25s appeared at masthead height, attacked within 30 seconds, and disappeared before effective fire could be concentrated. The few rounds that connected with attacking aircraft caused minimal damage to the rugged bombers. Lieutenant Commander Sato Torajiro, commanding the destroyer Tokitsuke's, recorded in his log, "Enemy tactics completely unexpected. Aircraft attacking at wave-top height, impossible to defend. Our guns cannot depress low enough, cannot track fast enough. Transports defenseless." At 1,245 hours, the second wave of B-25s arrived, 12 aircraft from 3rd Attack Group. These bombers had been slightly delayed by weather but now joined the attack with fresh fury. Their targets were the 5 remaining transports, all damaged to varying degrees and struggling to maintain formation. Iomaru became the 4th transport to sink. Major Ralph Chelly's attack placed 2 bombs directly into the ship's midsection, breaking her keel. The transport broke in half and sank in less than 4 minutes. Soldiers who managed to escape the sinking vessel found themselves in shark-infested waters with minimal life-saving equipment. The Japanese had not anticipated a disaster of this magnitude. Standard convoy procedures allocated lifeboats and rafts for perhaps 20% of embarked troops, sufficient for normal maritime emergencies but grotesquely inadequate for what was unfolding. Thousands of soldiers who survived the initial explosions and sinkings now faced death by drowning or exposure. Japanese destroyer captains faced agonizing decisions. Naval doctrine required them to rescue survivors, but remaining stationary to pick up men from the water made destroyers perfect targets for continued air attack. Several destroyer captains chose to continue rescue operations despite the danger. The destroyer Yukake's pulled 726 survivors from the water while under repeated strafing attacks from Australian Beaufighter aircraft. At 1,310 hours, American P-38 Lightning fighters arrived to provide cover for the bombers and strafe Japanese vessels. The air battle expanded as Japanese Zero fighters, operating at extreme range from Rabaul, attempted to protect what remained of the convoy. The Zeros shot down 3 Allied aircraft but could not stop the systematic destruction of the transport fleet. By 1,400 hours, 6 of the 8 transports were sunk or sinking. Only Oigawa Maru and Taime Maru remained afloat, both severely damaged and limping toward the New Guinea coast. Neither would survive the day. Additional B-25 attacks in the late afternoon sent both transports to the bottom. The destroyed convoy had carried 6,900 soldiers. Conservative estimates placed casualties at over 3,500 in the first day's attacks alone. March 3, 1943. 0630 hours. The destruction continued at first light. Allied reconnaissance aircraft had tracked the surviving destroyers throughout the night. For Japanese destroyers, Shikanami, Yukake's, Asagumo, and Arashio were attempting to rescue survivors scattered across 50 square miles of ocean. The other 4 destroyers had formed a protective screen, their anti-aircraft guns ready for the inevitable dawn attack. General Kenney ordered a final comprehensive strike. Every available aircraft from 5th Air Force received orders to converge on the Bismarck Sea. The force included 28 B-25 strafers, 12 B-17 heavy bombers, 16 Australian Beaufighters, and 12 P-38 fighters. The mission was simple: destroy everything Japanese in the target area. The attack commenced at 0755 hours. B-17s bombed from altitude while B-25s executed skip bombing runs against the destroyers. The Japanese warships, more maneuverable than the transports and with experienced crews, proved harder targets. Several destroyers sustained damage but none sank during the morning attacks. However, the attacks prevented any organized rescue operations. Destroyers attempting to recover survivors were forced to abandon rescue efforts and take evasive action. Thousands of Japanese soldiers still in the water watched helplessly as their potential rescuers steamed away under air attack. Lieutenant Nakagawa Hiroshi, one of the few surviving officers from the 115th Infantry Regiment, recorded his experience in testimony provided during post-war interrogations. "We had been in the water for 18 hours. Many men had already drowned from exhaustion or been taken by sharks. When we saw our destroyers approaching, we thought we were saved. Then the American planes returned. The destroyers could not stop. If they stopped, they would be sunk. We understood, but understanding did not prevent men from screaming as the ships passed without stopping." The most controversial aspect of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea occurred during these final attacks. Allied aircraft, primarily Australian Beaufighters and American B-25s, strafed lifeboats, rafts, and men in the water. The official justification was that these men would be rescued, return to combat, and kill Allied soldiers in future battles. 5th Air Force operations reports noted, all serviceable enemy life-saving equipment destroyed to prevent enemy personnel recovery. The ethics of attacking survivors generated immediate controversy. Some Allied pilots refused to strafe men in the water, considering it murder. Others argued military necessity. Every Japanese soldier killed in the Bismarck Sea was one fewer to fight at La. Squadron commanders generally left the decision to individual pilots. Japanese survivors reported that strafing attacks killed hundreds of men who had survived the ship sinkings. The psychological impact was profound. Soldiers who had endured the terror of skip bombing attacks and survived sinking ships now faced machine gun fire while defenseless in the water. By 1,000 hours, Allied aircraft had expended their ammunition and fuel, returning to base. The Bismarck Sea fell silent except for the cries of men still struggling in the water. The 4 Japanese destroyers that had been conducting rescue operations resumed their efforts, pulling exhausted soldiers from the water throughout the day. Admiral Kimura, aboard Shikanami, compiled preliminary casualty figures that evening. The numbers were catastrophic beyond any previous Japanese naval disaster. Of 6,900 soldiers embarked, fewer than 1,200 had been rescued. Approximately 5,700 were dead or missing. All 8 transports were destroyed. 4 destroyers sustained damage, though all remained operational. The convoy intended to reinforce La had been annihilated. March 4, 1943. Imperial General Headquarters, Tokyo. The initial reports from Admiral Kimura reached Tokyo via encrypted radio transmission. The message was brief and devastating: convoy destroyed. All transports lost. Estimate 80% casualties among embarked troops. American air tactics previously unknown. Unable to defend against low-altitude bombing attacks. The disaster sent shockwaves through Japanese military leadership. The loss of 5,700 soldiers in a single engagement exceeded Japanese casualties at Guadalcanal's bloodiest battles. More significantly, it represented the complete failure of Japanese convoy defense doctrine. The implications were catastrophic for Japan's strategic position in the Southwest Pacific. Vice Admiral Tomoshige Samejima, commanding the 8th Fleet, immediately ordered an investigation into the disaster. The findings, compiled from destroyer captains' reports and survivor testimony, revealed a tactical revolution that Japanese forces were unprepared to counter. The skip bombing technique, the massed low-altitude attacks, and the coordination between different bomber types had created a weapons system against which Japanese naval forces had no effective defense. Captain Yamamoto Yuji, senior naval aviation officer on Admiral Samejima's staff, submitted a detailed analysis on March 8. The Americans have developed a method that negates our anti-aircraft defenses. Their bombers attack at altitudes below our guns' effective depression angles, at speeds that prevent tracking, delivering bombs with accuracy that exceeds high-altitude bombing by orders of magnitude. Our current destroyer doctrine provides no counter to this threat. The report recommended sweeping changes: Convoy operations should occur only during darkness or under heavy cloud cover, air superiority must be established before convoys sail, and high-speed destroyer transports should replace slow merchant vessels for troop movements. However, Japan lacked the resources to implement these recommendations. The Imperial Japanese Navy had neither sufficient destroyers for exclusive troop transport nor enough aircraft to establish air superiority over Allied-controlled waters. At Rabaul, the survivors of the 115th Infantry Regiment assembled on March 6. Of 6,900 men who had boarded transports 8 days earlier, 1,196 stood formation. Many were wounded, all were traumatized, and none had weapons or equipment. The regiment had effectively ceased to exist as a combat unit. Colonel Takeo Yamamoto, the regiment's commanding officer who had survived because he was aboard a destroyer rather than a transport, addressed the survivors, "You have experienced the enemy's new way of war. Share what you learned with other units. The Americans possess capabilities we did not anticipate. They will use these capabilities again." His prediction proved accurate. The skip bombing tactics developed for Operation Bismarck Sea became standard procedure for Allied air forces throughout the Pacific. Japanese shipping losses accelerated dramatically in subsequent months. By war's end, Allied aircraft using skip bombing and similar low-altitude attack methods had sunk over 2,000 Japanese vessels. The immediate tactical impact at Laos was decisive. Without reinforcements, the Japanese garrison of 9,000 troops faced 15,000 Australian and American forces with complete Allied air superiority. Japanese commanders recognized the position was untenable. On August 16, 1943, Imperial General Headquarters authorized evacuation of Laos. The garrison withdrew through jungle trails to Finschhafen, suffering additional severe casualties during the retreat. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea had effectively ended Japanese offensive capability in New Guinea. The remaining forces would fight defensive actions for the next 2 years, slowly being pushed back toward Rabaul and eventually bypassed entirely by MacArthur's island-hopping campaign. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. March 10, 1943. Allied Air Force Headquarters, Brisbane, Australia. General Douglas MacArthur stood before assembled war correspondents, preparing to announce what would become one of the most significant Allied victories in the Pacific War. The Supreme Commander Southwest Pacific Area had delayed the press conference for 6 days, ensuring all survivors had been accounted for and intelligence assessments completed. "Gentlemen," MacArthur began, "I can now reveal that between March 2 and 4, American and Australian air forces completely destroyed a major Japanese convoy attempting to reinforce their garrison at Laos, New Guinea. All 8 enemy transports were sunk. We estimate between 12,000 and 15,000 enemy troops were killed." MacArthur's figures were inflated, a common practice in wartime communiques. The actual number was closer to 5,700 killed, but even this conservative figure represented a catastrophic Japanese defeat. War correspondents immediately recognized the significance. This was not merely a tactical victory but a fundamental shift in the Pacific War's momentum. The press release, distributed worldwide on March 11, emphasized several key points. American airpower had achieved what naval surface forces might have required days to accomplish, new bombing techniques had proven devastatingly effective against ship targets, and Japanese attempts to reinforce their positions would now face unprecedented danger from Allied aircraft. In Washington, the Joint Chiefs of Staff studied the battle's implications for future Pacific strategy. The success of skip bombing validated General Kenney's experimental tactics and justified increased production of medium bombers specifically configured for anti-shipping roles. Within weeks, orders went out for additional B-25 modifications, expanding the Strafer conversion program to squadrons throughout the Pacific theater. The psychological impact on Japanese military planning was equally profound. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, chief of the Naval General Staff's Operations Section, wrote in his diary on March 15, "The Bismarck Sea disaster demonstrates that we can no longer move large forces by sea within range of enemy land-based aircraft. This fundamentally limits our operational options throughout the Southwest Pacific. Japanese strategic planning adapted accordingly. Large-scale troop movements by slow convoy became impossible in contested waters. The Imperial Japanese Navy increasingly relied on high-speed destroyer runs, the famous Tokyo Express or Rat Run operations, to move small numbers of troops under cover of darkness. These operations could transport hundreds rather than thousands, fundamentally limiting Japan's ability to concentrate forces. At Port Moresby, General Kenney's staff conducted detailed analysis of the battle's tactics and results. Major Paul Gunn, whose modifications had made the B-25 strafers possible, received promotion to lieutenant colonel and authorization to expand the conversion program. His teams would eventually modify over 400 B-25 bombers for the strafer role, creating what historians now recognize as one of the war's most effective specialized aircraft. The aircrews who had executed the attacks received recognition commensurate with their achievement. Captain William Benn, who had sunk Kyakusei Maru in the first attack, received the Distinguished Service Cross. 12 other pilots received Silver Stars for their actions during the 3-day battle. Australian Beaufighter crews received similar recognition from their government. However, the celebrations were tempered by awareness of the human cost. Allied aircrews had witnessed the destruction of thousands of enemy soldiers, many of whom died horrible deaths by burning, drowning, or shark attack. Squadron chaplains reported increased attendance at religious services and noted that many pilots struggled with the ethical implications of their actions, particularly the strafing of survivors. Captain Raymond Wilkins, who had sunk Tio Maru, later wrote in his personal diary, "We did what was necessary. Those soldiers would have killed our men at La. But I cannot forget the sight of men in the water, burning oil around them, our tracers cutting through their ranks." Victory carries a weight that press releases never mention. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea established principles that would govern anti-shipping warfare for the remainder of World War II and beyond. The combination of intelligence, coordination between aircraft types, and innovative attack methods became the template for subsequent operations throughout the Pacific and in other theaters. April 1943. The lessons from the Bismarck Sea spread rapidly through both Allied and Japanese military organizations. At air bases throughout the Pacific, bomber crews received intensive training in skip bombing techniques. What had been an experimental tactic developed by a handful of innovators became standard doctrine for the 5th Air Force and eventually for other Pacific commands. Training procedures developed at Port Moresby became formalized into official technical manuals. The Army Air Forces established skip bombing schools at airfields in Australia and later in the Philippines. Wrecked ships were deliberately positioned in shallow waters to serve as practice targets. Crews flew hundreds of practice runs, learning the precise timing required to release bombs at masthead height so they would skip into targets rather than overshoot or strike the water short. The technical requirements were demanding. Pilots had to approach targets at exactly 200 to 250 feet altitude while maintaining speeds between 250 to 265 miles per hour. The bomb release point had to be judged perfectly. Too close and the bomber might be damaged by its own bomb's explosion, too far and the bomb would skip over the target. The margin for error was minimal, but trained crews achieved hit rates exceeding 60%, vastly superior to the 2 to 3% accuracy of high-altitude bombing against ship targets. Japanese forces attempted to develop countermeasures. Anti-aircraft gun manufacturers modified their weapons to depress to lower angles, but physics imposed limitations. Ships' superstructures blocked fields of fire at the masthead altitudes B-25s employed. Some destroyer captains experimented with towing barrage balloons on steel cables, hoping to snare low-flying aircraft, but the tactic proved impractical in combat conditions where ships needed to maneuver rapidly. The most effective Japanese countermeasure was simply avoiding situations where Allied aircraft could attack convoys. Troop movements shifted almost entirely to nighttime destroyer runs, accepting the severe limitations this imposed on the numbers of men and equipment that could be transported. The strategic implications were profound. Japan could no longer rapidly concentrate forces in threatened areas, fundamentally undermining their defensive strategy. Intelligence assessments by both sides recognized the battle's broader significance. Allied intelligence officer Commander Edwin Layton wrote in a report dated May 1943, "The Bismarck Sea engagement represents a turning point in Pacific naval warfare. The Japanese have lost confidence in their ability to move forces by sea within range of our land-based aircraft. This effectively cedes control of the sea lanes to Allied forces without requiring major naval surface engagements." Japanese intelligence reached similar conclusions. A report from the Combined Fleet Staff noted, "Enemy skip bombing tactics have rendered our standard convoy defense measures obsolete. Until we achieve local air superiority or develop effective countermeasures, large-scale amphibious operations within enemy aircraft range are not feasible. This severely constrains our strategic options." The Butcher's Bill from the Bismarck Sea continued to affect Japanese operations for months afterward. The destruction of the 51 St. Division's 115th Infantry Regiment created a hole in Japanese order of battle that could not easily be filled. Replacement troops required months to train, transport to the theater, and integrate into units. The survivors of the regiment, traumatized and without equipment, required extensive rehabilitation before returning to combat effectiveness. Medical records from Japanese military hospitals documented the psychological toll. Hundreds of survivors exhibited what modern medicine would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Many refused to board ships again, creating discipline problems. Some became outspoken critics of Japan's military leadership, arguing privately that continuing the war against America's industrial might was futile, dangerous talk in militaristic wartime Japan. The battle's ripple effects extended into Japanese domestic politics. The government had announced the convoy's departure as a major reinforcement operation, promising that brave troops would drive the Allies from New Guinea. When the convoy's destruction could no longer be concealed, the government was forced to issue a vague communiqué acknowledging the loss of several transports to enemy air attack. The Japanese public, increasingly skeptical of official pronouncements, recognized this as a euphemism for disaster. By mid-1943, the strategic situation in the Southwest Pacific had fundamentally changed. Japanese forces remained dangerous opponents capable of fierce resistance, but their ability to maneuver forces, reinforce threatened positions, or mount offensive operations had been severely curtailed. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea's ultimate significance extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Military historians now recognize it as a pivotal moment when air power definitively proved its dominance over naval surface forces in certain tactical situations. The battle demonstrated that land-based aircraft, properly equipped and tactically employed, could achieve what previously required battleships and cruisers: the destruction of enemy naval forces and the prevention of amphibious operations. The strategic consequences reverberated throughout 1943 and beyond. General MacArthur's island-hopping campaign relied fundamentally on the principle that Allied air power could isolate Japanese garrisons by interdicting their supply lines. The Bismarck Sea proved this concept decisively. Japanese commanders understood that any position within range of Allied air bases would slowly starve as convoys attempting resupply were destroyed. This understanding influenced Japanese defensive strategy for the remainder of the war. The decision to bypass and isolate major Japanese strongholds like Rabaul rather than assault them directly was predicated on confidence that air power could prevent reinforcement or evacuation. The Bismarck Sea had demonstrated this capability unambiguously. The human cost of the battle remained its most sobering aspect. For the 5,700 Japanese soldiers who died in the Bismarck Sea, the promise of honorable death in combat defending emperor and homeland ended instead in drowning, burning, or shark attack while helpless in the water. Their families received terse notifications that their loved ones had died gloriously in battle, with no details of the actual circumstances. The 1,196 survivors carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Post-war interviews with veterans revealed that many suffered recurring nightmares of burning ships and drowning comrades. Several survivors described feeling survivor's guilt, wondering why they had been pulled from the water while thousands of others drowned. These were not abstract statistics but individual tragedies multiplied thousands of times. For Allied aircrews, victory came with its own psychological burden. They had executed their mission with devastating effectiveness, but many struggled with the human reality of what they had done. Veterans Administration records from the post-war period show that Bismarck Sea participants sought treatment for combat-related stress disorders at rates higher than average for Pacific War veterans. The controversy over strafing survivors continued for decades. Some veterans defended it as military necessity. Every enemy soldier killed was one who would not fight at La or elsewhere. Others expressed regret, feeling they had crossed moral boundaries even while acknowledging the war's brutal logic. The debate highlighted the ethical complexities that industrial warfare imposed on individual combatants. The battle's technical legacy proved enduring. Skip bombing tactics developed for the Bismarck Sea influenced anti-shipping warfare through the Korean War and beyond. The fundamental principle, using low-altitude attack to achieve accuracy while minimizing target acquisition time, informed the development of anti-ship missiles in the jet age. Modern precision-guided munitions represent the technological evolution of concepts proven effective in the Bismarck Sea 72 years ago. In Japan, the Bismarck Sea disaster became a case study in the dangers of underestimating enemy capabilities and failing to adapt to changing tactical realities. Post-war Japanese military academies studied the battle as an example of how technological innovation could render established doctrine obsolete virtually overnight. The lesson resonated beyond pure military contexts. Japanese industrial strategy in the post-war period emphasized technological flexibility and rapid adaptation to changing circumstances, arguably influenced by hard lessons from battles like the Bismarck Sea. Today, both American and Japanese military historians recognize the Battle of the Bismarck Sea as a turning point in the Pacific War. The battle demonstrated conclusively that Japan could not sustain forces distant from the home islands against American industrial and technological superiority. The streams of bombs that skipped across the Bismarck Sea's waters on March 2 to 4, 1943, didn't just sink ships, they sank Japanese hopes of successfully defending their Pacific conquests. The 8 transports that left Rabaul carrying 6,900 soldiers represented Japan's commitment to holding New Guinea. The fact that only 1,196 men survived to reach land represented the futility of that commitment against an enemy who could innovate, adapt, and employ industrial resources at scales Japan could not match. General Kenney's B-25 strafers had rewritten the rules of naval warfare and accelerated the Pacific War's inexorable momentum toward Allied victory. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.